On a sweltering summer day, August 8, 1954, at precisely 10:45 in the morning, a scene of utter chaos erupted in the humble home of Nannie Doss, nestled in the heart of Tulsa, Oklahoma. In a shocking turn of events, the police were called to a small hospital where Doss's latest husband, Robert Dunstan, had been rushed after a mysterious illness. As the paramedics fought to save his life, Doss calmly strolled into the hospital room, her eyes fixed on her husband with a mixture of emotions, a chilling smile spreading across her face. The air was thick with tension as the doctors and nurses exchanged worried glances, sensing something was terribly amiss. The atmosphere was about to take a dark and sinister turn. The hospital room was a flurry of activity as the medical staff desperately tried to revive Robert Dunstan, but it was too late, the damage had already been done. The walls seemed to close in as the reality of the situation hit home, another victim of Nannie Doss's malevolent hand. The beeping of machines, the murmur of hushed conversations, and the faint scent of antiseptic filled the air, creating an unsettling backdrop for the drama that was unfolding. The hospital's sterile environment couldn't have been a more stark contrast to the evil that had taken root in the heart of this seemingly ordinary housewife. In this moment, the lives of those around her hung precariously in the balance. At the center of this maelstrom was Nannie Doss herself, a woman who exuded an aura of innocence and charm, even as her true nature seemed to seep from every pore. Her smile was a mask, a carefully crafted deception that belied the horrors she had unleashed upon her loved ones. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, had grown cold and calculating, the result of years of calculated manipulation and deceit. Her very presence seemed to draw the life force out of those around her, leaving in its wake a trail of death and destruction. As the minutes ticked by, the gravity of her crimes was about to be laid bare. Witnesses claimed to have seen Nannie Doss stroll into the hospital room, her demeanor eerily calm, as if she was merely visiting a friend. The sounds of beeping machines and hushed conversations masked the horror that was unfolding, but those who were present couldn't help but sense that something was off. One witness reported seeing Doss's eyes flicker towards the lifeless body of her husband, a fleeting moment of emotion that seemed to speak volumes about her true character. As the reality of her crimes began to sink in, the hospital room seemed to grow quieter, as if the very air itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Nannie Doss, a woman from rural Alabama, is the central figure in this case. Born on November 4, 1905, she grew up in the small town of Blue Mountain, Alabama. At the time of her birth, the population was a little over 500 residents, and the town's economy was mainly driven by the railroad industry. Doss's early life would shape her personality and her actions in the future. Her early life was marked by hardship, abuse, and neglect. Doss's daily life was one of toil and drudgery. As a child, she was forced to work on the family farm alongside her siblings, with little time for education or leisure. Her father, James Hazel, was a controlling and abusive man who made sure his children knew their place. Nannie's mother, Louisa, often clashed with James, but she was no better to her children, often using them as a means to keep James at bay. Despite the difficulties at home, Nannie's favorite pastime was reading romance magazines with her mother. Nannie's personality was complex, to say the least. She was a master manipulator, able to turn on the charm to get what she wanted from people. At the same time, she was a troubled soul, haunted by the consequences of her father's abuse and her own perceived inadequacies. Her mental health issues would lead to a lifetime of struggles, including severe headaches, blackouts, and depression. These conditions made her increasingly dependent on others for emotional support, often leading her to form toxic relationships. So, who did Nannie trust? Well, it was a select few, mainly men who were willing to provide for her emotionally and financially. Her string of husbands and boyfriends often suffered at the hands of her jealousy, possessiveness, and controlling behavior. Nannie's relationships were tumultuous, to say the least, and often ended in tragic consequences for those who got too close to her. Her lack of empathy for others would eventually catch up with her, leading to a trail of dead bodies and devastated families. In the months leading up to the incident, something changed within Nannie, something that would set her on a path of destruction and chaos. It was a warm summer evening in June 1927, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The sun had just set behind the rolling hills, casting a golden glow over the small neighborhood where Nannie Doss lived with her husband Charlie Braggs. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming flowers. Nannie and Charlie were sitting in their small living room, watching the news on the radio, when suddenly there was a knock at the door. Nannie got up to answer it, expecting it to be one of their neighbors. As Nannie opened the door, she saw her sister Edna standing there, looking frantic. Edna had been arguing with their father, James, just hours before, and Nannie could tell that something was wrong. Edna stormed in, slamming the door behind her, and began to vent her frustrations to Nannie. Nannie listened intently, offering words of comfort and support. Meanwhile, Charlie Bragg sat on the couch, oblivious to the drama unfolding in front of him. As the argument between Edna and Nannie escalated, it became clear that Edna was planning to leave her husband, Frank, and their children. Edna had been unhappy in the marriage for some time, and Nannie had often encouraged her to stand up for herself. But now, something had triggered Edna's decision to take action. In a fit of rage, Edna snatched a cup of coffee from the counter and threw it at Nannie's mother, who was lying on the couch. The cup hit Nannie's mother in the head, causing severe burns. The most shocking single detail of the crime was that Nannie's mother had been suffering from severe burns for weeks before her death, and Nannie had been administering her own concoction of home remedies, claiming they were necessary to alleviate her pain. But what Nannie didn't tell anyone was that her concoction was actually a highly toxic mix of arsenic and other poisons, which she had been using to kill off her family members one by one. As Nannie watched her mother's life slip away, she felt a sense of relief wash over her, knowing that the source of her own pain and suffering was finally gone. The family was in shock when they discovered the extent of Nannie's cruelty. Edna was the first to realize that something was terribly wrong, and she immediately called for an ambulance. The paramedics arrived and took Nannie's mother to the hospital, where she was pronounced dead. Edna was devastated, but she knew she had to expose Nannie's evil plan to the authorities. She called the police and told them everything, and soon, Nannie was behind bars, facing charges of murder. Comment below, what do you think really happened here? Did Nannie Doss plan her mother's death, or was it just a tragic accident? We'll explore this and more in our next video, as we delve into the investigation and uncover the shocking truth behind Nannie's crimes. But first, let's take a look at the full scale of what occurred. Nannie's killing spree didn't stop with her mother's death, oh no. It was just the beginning. Over the next few years, Nannie would go on to kill 4 more husbands, 2 children, 1 of her sisters, and 2 grandsons, all of whom fell victim to her poisonous concoctions. And yet, despite her reputation as a serial killer, Nannie remained calm and collected, always managing to maintain a facade of innocence and charm. But behind closed doors, she was a ticking time bomb, waiting to unleash her next attack. And speaking of which, let's cut to the investigation. Police were baffled by Nannie's sudden confessions, which seemed to come out of nowhere. They arrested her and questioned her about her motives, but Nannie seemed to be one step ahead of them, always staying just out of reach. As the investigation continued, one question kept popping up: what drove Nannie to commit such heinous crimes? Was it a desire for freedom, or a warped sense of love? We'll explore these questions and more in our next video, so stay tuned for the next part of this true crime saga. In October 1954, when her 5th husband, Robert Dunlop, died at a small hospital in Tulsa, Oklahoma, police were called in to investigate, and it was during this investigation that they first spoke to Nannie Doss. Initially, Doss appeared cooperative, answering questions from the detectives. She told them that her husband had died of a heart attack, but as they dug deeper, they noticed inconsistencies in her story. The police started searching Doss' home and found a disturbing number of urns containing ashes, which Doss claimed were the remains of her dead relatives. At first, Doss denied any wrongdoing. The key piece of evidence that changed everything was a piece of paper found among Doss' possessions. It was a handwritten list of the people she had killed, along with their dates of death. This list, along with other disturbing evidence, including a large quantity of arsenic, a common poison, in Doss' home, suggested that Nannie Doss was not who she seemed to be. Detectives interviewed Doss' family members and acquaintances, and they revealed a pattern of abuse and cruelty that Doss had been subjected to throughout her life. However, as they dug deeper, they also uncovered a history of Doss' own violent behavior. Doss had a history of feuding with her own family members. As detectives began to suspect Nannie Doss, they started to look into her past, and they soon found themselves facing a complex web of relationships and motives. Doss' fifth husband, Robert Dunlop, had been a wealthy man, and Doss stood to gain a large sum of money from his death. Her fourth husband, Louis Doss, had been a kind and gentle man, but Nannie had a history of being cruel to him. Detectives also suspected Doss' sister, Myrtle, who had died under mysterious circumstances in 1943. However, as they continued to investigate, they found that Doss' family was full of secrets and lies. Her siblings seemed to be intimidated by their sister, and some even appeared to be protecting her. The red herring that wasted months of investigation was the focus on Doss' fourth husband, Louis Doss. Initially, detectives suspected that Louis had been the one to kill Robert Dunlop, but as they dug deeper, they found that he had been nothing more than a pawn in Nannie's game. In fact, Louis had been planning to leave Doss, citing her cruel behavior towards him. Detectives also discovered that Doss had been poisoning Louis for months before his death. However, it was only when they interviewed other family members and acquaintances that they finally pieced together the true extent of Nannie's depravity. As we wrap up the haunting tale of Nannie Doss, the Giggling Granny, a shocking twist emerges that left investigators stunned. Doss' motive for her murders was not just about insurance money or a desire for companionship. Instead, she harbored a deep-seated desire for love and affection that she never received. Her lonely heart's column obsession as a child fueled her quest for romance, which ultimately led to her descent into madness. This chilling revelation paints a picture of a complex and troubled individual driven by unfulfilled emotions. The revelation that Doss' childhood trauma played a significant role in her murderous ways has left many questioning whether she was truly responsible for her actions. Her childhood experiences, including the traumatic train accident and the rape by her own family members and acquaintances, left emotional scars that never fully healed. These scars manifested in her adulthood, leading to a pattern of violent behavior towards those closest to her. Her own family, including her mother and siblings, suffered at the hands of Nannie's wrath. Her crimes were not just random acts of violence, but a desperate cry for help and attention. The case of Nannie Doss remains unsolved to this day, with her guilty plea in 1954 the only conviction in a string of murders that shook the nation. Despite her confession, many have questioned the validity of her statements, citing the possibility of coercion and manipulation by authorities. In 1955, Doss was sentenced to life in prison, where she spent the remainder of her days. Her husband, Robert Doss, who died shortly before her confession, was never formally charged with any crimes. The investigation into his death remains a mystery to this day. Following her conviction, Doss' family members were either deceased or too traumatized to speak publicly about their experiences. Her fifth husband, Robert Doss, left behind a family that has since spoken out about his